Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Death in Old Mexico, the 1789 Dongo Murders, and How They Shaped the History of a Nation, by Nicole von Germeten, narrated by Stacy Gonzalez. Preface. A rectangular wooden table measuring 4 feet by 6 feet sits in a large, high-ceilinged room. The powerful midday sun slants through skylights at least 30 feet overhead, partially illuminating the table in bright blocks of light. About 100 pieces of paper, of various sizes, cover the table's black surface, from ragged scraps to large files of rectangular folios sewn together in a packet. Dark slanted handwriting adorns these papers, some of which show water stains and odd-shaped holes. Some have been organized into piles, and others sit on the surface. This scene took place in Mexico City during the summer of 2013 at the Archivo General de la Nación, AGN, reading room. Archivists and historians were in the process of putting thousands of pieces of paper in chronological order. These disorganized pages comprise some of the remnants of the vice-regal judicial system, which existed when Mexico was under Spanish rule from the 16th to the 19th century. This book takes inspiration from this table and its jumble of documents. It samples from the millions of pieces of paper that make up the historical record of New Spain, focusing on certain texts that were written from the mid-18th century through to the 21st century. It gathers together some of these fragments, mingling them to offer listeners a kind of historical kaleidoscope. When you look through the eyepiece down the body of this kaleidoscope/book, the multiple and shifting texts that are visible all relate to the history of death in Mexico. Inspired by the work of creative historians for the last several decades, I have written this book, to continue the kaleidoscope metaphor, with a mirror system, which reflects and combines the various documents in ways that will look different than the traditional scholarship. My goal is not to confuse or distort history, but to show how texts merge and reflect upon each other to create complex patterns that change, repeat, and generate endless subtle variations. Even the largest, most complex kaleidoscope cannot contain all of the texts or reflect all of the angles on the theme of death in Mexico. Therefore, I chose one compelling incident as my focus in this book, a crime that inspired a multitude of writings on the topic of violent death. The crime took place as New Spain transitioned from a European-ruled viceroyalty to a modern nation. Court scribes, historians, and novelists have had an ongoing conversation for the last 230 years about this one horrendous event: the murder of 11 people in a large house in Mexico City during the night of October 23, 1789. The victims included a wealthy Spanish businessman, his live-in cashier, and 9 domestic servants. From the morning of October 24th, when the notary viewing the bodies created his first report documenting their deaths, the massacre has held a potent yet changing symbolism. For the viceregal authorities, these killings were a call to action. They were motivated to find the murderers and wreak the state's vengeance on them. Unofficial commentators at the time wrote their impressions in shocked tones, noting the fast reactions of their leaders to solve the crime and execute the perpetrators. They pondered the cosmic order that allowed such horrors. After independence from Spain, Mexican writers expressed more ambiguity about the crime. To them, the crime and its aftermath showed both the best, strong, effective leaders, and the worst, greed and violence, of their history, as part of an empire ruled from Europe. After Mexico's mid-19th century reforms, novelists felt inspired to depict the massacre according to the values that they wished to foster in their own era. They added sexual and political interpretations to the events that do not appear in the original 18th century accounts. More recently, professional historians have analyzed this case in the context of the viceregal judiciary. This book does not take a conventional form. Instead, I hope that it will allow listeners to observe a variety of images in conversation with each other. Because the entire textual record consists of fragments written from individual perspectives, whether a few lines on a scrap of paper or a 2-volume novel, no one source allows us to comprehend the entire story and its repercussions. I decided to surrender to the path where the texts led me, guiding listeners through a fascinating journey that serves as an entry point to understanding this era. The chapters that follow are organized into 7 parts, each with a slightly different writing style and citational style, drawing entirely from the documents that a scribe began to write on the morning of October 24th, 1789. The story begins with a present-tense narration of the scene and setting of the crime and what led up to it. Part 1 describes what observers of this event experienced, without multiple layers of interpretation and scholarly apparatus. Part 2 gives a more conventional historical background of Mexico City in the 1780s and early 1790s, with an overview of the viceroys in power at this time, the justice system, and the Spanish Empire. Part 3 returns to the style of Part 1, recounting how the investigation unfolded in the 1789 case file. Part 4 draws more broadly from historical scholarship to present the characters involved, including the murdered man and his killers. Part 5 describes the punishment of the perpetrators and places it within the context of the reforms of late 18th century judicial culture. While the first 5 parts of the book experiment with an unconventional writing style for an academic history book, the final 2 parts delve into unusual coincidences and mysterious sources. Part 6 focuses on the geography of death in the late viceregal capital. It speculates on the resonance of this murder and its aftermath as it relates to the staged spectacles of death in Mexico City's Central Plaza and the surrounding streets. Then the kaleidoscope twists, so viewers can ponder a confusing series of events that puzzled residents in the late 1780s and early 1790s. In the same handful of years, when hundreds of men and women were tortured and executed in the Plaza Mayor, laborers on public works projects unearthed Aztec artifacts only a stone's throw away from the busy gallows. The authorities reburied 2 of these monoliths, the stone of Tizoc and the statue of Coatlicue, due to their perceived association with human sacrifice. Ironies echo through the entire book, as imperialism influences perceptions of violence, and when it is tolerated, encouraged, or suppressed. Another slight twist illustrates how Mexico City residents interpreted natural phenomena that occurred in the years just before and after the murders, storms, earthquakes, and celestial events, as supernatural omens. Part 7 turns entirely to an analysis of the sources for information on the Dongo massacre, including 2 novels which add another 1,600 pages of highly personal interpretations to this story. Arguably, these texts represent early examples of true crime in Mexico and contain many of the controversial themes that persist in this genre to the present day. Overall, this book narrates the sights, smells, and sounds of daily life in late 18th century Mexico City, with an effort to recreate sensory details. Most importantly, it demonstrates how one extremely violent night can shape the history of a nation. Introduction. Please note, this introduction frames the crime at the heart of the book with vignettes of historical and textual background. adding a few additional fragments to the kaleidoscope of murder and its aftermath in late 18th century Mexico City. It proposes the 1789 murders, which are the topic of this book, as early examples of Mexican true crime. The introduction also includes select critiques regarding this genre and other comments on the different genres of literature depicting murder in Mexico. Along the way, a few spoilers are revealed. Some listeners might prefer to skip directly to Chapter 1. This book recreates a paper trail of Enlightenment-era greed and savagery that began with a brutal massacre. The events that took place on the night of October 23, 1789, led to a vast array of politicized depictions in a variety of fiction and nonfiction writings for the next century. The action in this book takes place in a city square called the Zócalo. Before 1521, this plaza represented the sacred center of the Aztec city. From 1521 to 1524, the Spanish tore down the Zócalo's pyramids and other structures, rebuilding it as the epicenter for both church and state. The plaza became the site for hundreds of officially sanctioned executions and spectacles of torture. When Mexico City, Tenochtitlan, is envisioned as a quincunx, the Zócalo represents the center point. The Zócalo is also adjacent to the location where the three killers carried out their massacres. The victims and their killers were buried with suitable Baroque pomp. Then, they were symbolically covered with thousands of handwritten and typed pages discussing their deaths. Unlike these bodies, the priceless stone treasures discussed in later chapters of this book refused to remain buried. Writing the murders. Mexico City, October 24, 1789, dawned with the most noteworthy misfortune it has ever seen. In his own house, in the course of a robbery, Don Joaquin Dongo was killed, along with his brother-in-law and 9 of his servants, 5 men and 4 women, 11 people in all. These deaths were a greater spectacle than has ever been seen before or read about in stories. So begins a short narration of the crime, a small section of a memoir known as The Diary of the Events of Mexico by the halberdier José Gómez. This memoir chronicles the month-by-month happenings in the viceregal court from 1776 to 1798. Gómez, a Spaniard born in Granada in 1732, maintained this handwritten journal until a year before he died. Although his topics range from current fashions to earthquakes, most of his entries focus on the latest news relating to his fellow halberdiers, public judicial punishments, and the movements of the viceroys, under whom Gómez served as an armed guard during the decades that he wrote his journal. Gómez witnessed close to 250 executions in the 22 years covered by his journal. But his account of the 1789 massacre stands out for its superlatives. In the few lines quoted earlier, he repeats the phrase, no se ha visto, conveying his shock with this never-seen-before violence. From his self-described, uneducated point of view, even fiction had never depicted anything of this kind. Interspersed with the events of the new viceroy's first few weeks in New Spain, Gómez's memoir narrates the investigation of the crime and its rapid and gruesome resolution. Little did he know that his diario would be the first of at least a dozen commentaries that would be written about the massacre for more than 2 centuries, and arguably an early contribution to Mexico's version of the true crime genre. The Dongo story as true crime. True crime has become a multifaceted, multi-genre aesthetic formulation, a poetics of murder narration. True crime is a way of making sense of the senseless, but true crime always fictionalizes, emphasizes, exaggerates, interprets, constructs, and creates truth, and any relationship to the facts is mediated and compromised. The massacre of 1789 led to numerous published and unpublished accounts, which all contain the essential elements of the familiar true crime narration. One of the defining characteristics of the genre is the presentation of conventional ways to think about and discuss evil, which change over time and across societies, while making a confident but dubious claim to accuracy, truth, and fact. Scholars of true crime trace its origins back to sermons and broadsheets that were printed in the context of the executions of notorious killers. These focused on sin and the ways that church and state successfully reincorporated even executed killers back into the fold. The mid-18th century development of Gothic horror popularized adding graphic descriptions, gore, and inscrutable or supernatural elements to accounts of murder. Killers became beasts, or monsters, inhuman interlopers in civil society. Later, in the 19th century, a social science-influenced approach developed, which included psychological analysis and forensically detailed descriptions of the crime scene, narrated with a tone of objectivity and lacking the previous eerie mystery. With the growth of podcasts and streaming, true crime has experienced such a boom that scholars can barely keep up with the constant international developments. As the true crime genre becomes more popular in different media, it has inspired more criticism. As it is a repetitive and formulaic genre, the biases inherent in contemporary true crime existed even in the 18th and 19th centuries, and proliferate in the texts examined in this book. First, the prevalence of psychological analysis has detached most true crime from any historical contextualization, instead situating perpetrators on their own, isolated and deranged psychic islands. Murderers seem to emerge sui generis out of troubled families, influenced only by their immediate circle and their disordered psyches. Secondly, from time immemorial, crime and its public punishment has brought communities together, under the illusion that most victims are ordinary people. Even in the Dongo case, with a victim born to an elite social sphere, all observers and commentators assume that Mexico City residents, rich and poor, vulnerable and powerful, European, Black and Indigenous, celebrated the solving of the murders. Lastly, modern true crime entertains consumers with stories that juxtapose a belief in the effectiveness of authority figures, law enforcement, and technology, with the spectacle of tortured and dehumanized bodies. With the development of law codes and courts, and later professional law enforcement, the emphasis in true crime moved from divine to human order. The rapid solving of murders by professional or amateur detectives argues for following the rules. It reaffirms social, governmental, and judicial structures. Chaos becomes order. Danger transforms into safety and trust that authorities are doing their jobs. The Dongo massacre also offered commentators the opportunity to narrate their political opinions. These range from the comforting medieval vision of God quickly resolving all crimes to blaming only the killer's self-contained and isolated evil. True crime as history. True crime reports on past newsworthy murder narratives, with an emotional component intended to prioritize such sensations as horror, fear, pain, and frustration, which is either to its shame or its credit, depending on the disposition of the observer. Some crimes, such as the Manson family killings or the murders attributed to Jack the Ripper, change the course of history, and as such, constitute a useful field of study for academic historians. Historians can narrate and analyze accounts of crime to investigate how the authorities in any given society manipulate emotions to effect policy, most notably the politicization of fear. Crime narrations, including the Dongo case, allow historians to engage their readers by presenting detailed accounts of mundane life, interspersed with bizarre and sensational events. Most accounts of crimes, by necessity, dwell on a certain geographic locale, allowing historians to recreate some aspects of this space for their readers. The most terrifying crimes inspire political action. 20 years after the Dongo killings, London also experienced shocking news: the nighttime homicide of two families in buildings where they both lived and carried out their businesses, the infamous Ratcliffe Highway murders. Similar to Mexico City in the late 18th century, these deaths prompted major reforms in law enforcement, and eventually the creation of the so-called bobbies, or peelers, in 1830, instigated by Robert Peel. Newspaper accounts of the Ratcliffe Highway murders continued a popular tradition of true crime writing in English that had already existed for at least 2 centuries, a genre which grew and arguably reached its peak over the course of the 19th century. Genres of crime narrations, whether fiction or nonfiction, have certain binding conventions, including a suspenseful tone, easy-to-read style, familiar and stereotypical characters, and an ending that proves that reason always triumphs over irrationality and order over disorder. In their introduction to an edited volume on modern Mexican crime stories, Robert Buffington and Pablo Picato draw from the work of Emile Durkheim, Carlo Ginzburg, and others to summarize a number of important theoretical perspectives on crime as history. In late 18th century New Spain, and today, most societies, and especially those in power, eagerly exploit evidence of growing crimes to criticize the degradation of some of their subjects. However, the perpetrators of what are perceived as criminal activities can actually show us the problematic aspects of any given society and the areas where change must or will occur. Narrations that seem focused on rational crime solving based on evidence and so-called common sense analysis actually reveal how the judiciary or amateur investigators perceive and assess subtle social behaviors as clues. Lastly, critiquing presentations of the rational crime-solving mindset of judges or other law enforcement can remind us, as historians, to question our confidence in our own methods. Crime genres in Mexico. James Bond could never exist in a country like Mexico, where the organs of modern security, the police and the bureaucrats, are assassins, whose xenophobia is directed internally at the Mexican people. The problems with the true crime genre and other crime-related forms of writing, either fictional or nonfiction, multiply when applied to Mexico. From Gomez's memoirs to the most recently published scholarship, all accounts of the Dongo massacre and its aftermath absorb the Enlightenment vision of a tidy ending, affected by decisive, rational, European men. The story of the Dongo massacre repeats the common tropes of the genre: a setting in a major urban metropolis, hard-working and intelligent sleuths who succeed in uncovering the identity of those who disrupt order, and criminals who appear to be respectable contributors to society, but who actually only foment disorder. Early crime writers Thomas de Quincey and Edgar Allan Poe proposed the idea of murder as a fine art, or as an opportunity to create intellectual heroes out of those who solve crimes, whether professional law enforcement or amateur sleuths. As a man influenced by the Enlightenment culture of his time, Gomez follows the classic crime writing style of tying up loose ends. This approach contradicts how crime writing functions in modern Mexico, where authors reject what they view as an Anglo-Saxon middle-class genre that has little applicability in the Mexican context. From this perspective, Retellings of the Dongo story to the present day endorse the colonial paternalism of those vice-regal officials who brought the perpetrators to their interpretation of justice. Each textual reiteration of these murders and their resolution reinforces two of the essential aspects of Western modernity: government monopoly on violence and a celebration of increasing surveillance. Overall, the most acclaimed Mexican crime writing takes an anti-establishment tone, critical of globalization, and the failures of revolutionary ideologies, along the way, subverting the hegemonic narratives of modernity. However, writings about the Dongo events first appeared during the viceregal era and continued throughout the 19th century, long before Mexican authors embraced this anti-colonial, anti-capitalist stance. As such, these accounts imitated European models, even to the point of including elements of 18th century Gothic literature. This imitation of European styles of narrating crimes began with the first handwritten document describing the massacre. Within a few days of the murders, all accounts focus on how the state reinstated order and safety, protecting the populace from danger. Dongo's stories repeatedly reinforce European ideas of governments controlling the darkness and madness of Mexican subjects. Even in the 21st century, academic historians have not yet rejected this rationalist approach, born out of vice-regal worldviews. As opposed to the Enlightenment-influenced crime-solving narrations so common in true crime and fictional detective stories, Fernando Fabio Sanchez suggests that death, not law and order, functions as the central national symbol influencing Mexican crime writing. Sanchez argues that in a nation born via assassinations dating back to the 1810s, murderers are suitable national heroes, in contrast to the enlightened authorities who resolved this crime. This book's retelling of the 1789 case takes advantage of the popularity of the true crime genre, while also attempting to complicate it by contextualizing its horrific violence, challenging the narrative which presents participants, commentators, and scholars repeatedly congratulating the viceregal authorities for rapidly resolving the Dongo murders. This book also questions the highly conventional political goals of true crime, as seen in the dozens of retellings of the Dongo story throughout the last 2 centuries. Most importantly, the goal of revisiting this multiple homicide is to engage listeners with Mexico City's viceregal history, even if we must enter this Baroque urban space through the doorway of true crime. Part 1. Murder. 1. The scene of the crime. October 24th, 1789. 3 a.m. After several hours of quiet rest, a few light sleepers in the northern blocks of central Mexico City toss and turn in their beds. Rumbling noises coming from the street disturb their slumber. A Dominican friar, pacing his cell, hears a rapidly moving carriage traveling toward the north. A Spaniard who runs a nearby tavern starts awake, jarred by a sound. 6 a.m. Melchor de Leon always wakes up before the first weak rays of sunlight pass above the horizon. He's a busy man who must start his day early. He leads a squadron of dragoons in Mexico City and must look the part. Sitting up in bed, he pulls on his coat, breeches, and boots in the dark barracks before opening the door onto the street. Today, blinking his eyes in surprise, Leon notices something strange. An expensive-looking coach stands empty in the middle of the street. Still attached, well-fed mules shift their legs and stare at him, confusion evident in their brown eyes. Leon walks up to the coach, calms the mules, and then looks up and down the street. No one is around. He calls out loudly for the driver or any passengers, but the street remains quiet. He re-enters the barracks and addresses the sleepy soldiers, who are starting to wake up. "Do you know who this coach belongs to?" None of them have any idea. Leon walks to the rooms where his colonel sleeps and finds the coachman already.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?